My Govanden. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and one of the things that Tolkien is pretty well regarded for, even by those who don't necessarily particularly like his work, is his ability to craft a really convincing world. Uh, his world building skills are just phenomenal, and of course, a lot of this in The Lord of the Rings is the benefit of the fact that he had already been building the world of Middle-earth in the Silmarillion for decades before he wrote The Lord of the Rings itself, and so he had a lot of material to fall back on. But of course, he added a lot of history in The Lord of the Rings as well, because he ended up drafting all this material for the appendices to give backstories to the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, lots of stuff like that. And this particular aspect of his world building comes through really well in the fact that all of the stories in The Lord of the Rings, subplots, plots, all of this, they all end up being parts of much longer, broader scope tales that end up going back centuries, millennia, or even ages in Middle-earth. And so in this video, what I want to do is explore some of the ways in which those tales within tales really bring out the world building of Tolkien and show how they make the stories themselves so much richer. So let's take a look. Of course, we could state the obvious fact that the Silmarillion, of course, starts with literally the beginning of the universe as it is known in Middle-earth, and therefore everything is kind of part of the same story set up by the music of the Ainur. But that's really kind of it's almost a, it's so obvious it doesn't really tell you anything. I mean, the story is all one big story. Okay, that doesn't tell us much. It's interesting because Tolkien, as far as I know, I mean, there's probably somebody else out there who's done this, but Tolkien, as far as I know, is the only one who has ever done something as big and cosmic as literally starting with the creation and moving forward in terms of creating a mythological fiction. So that in itself is somewhat interesting, but the more interesting things about the way this works out in The Lord of the Rings is when we get into the more granular elements and look at the more zoomed in parts and see how these different stories interweave and how they, all affect each other at the end of the day. And so some of the comments that even that we get in The Lord of the Rings itself point to this phenomenon. I mean, we get this idea that Frodo is carrying on Bilbo's story that very much comes through once Frodo reaches Rivendell, and also to a certain extent even before that in the Shadow of the Past chapter, where Gandalf is kind of explaining, the history of the ring and all this other stuff. And even that points to broader vistas in the past. The ring itself has a long history, and that gets caught up in a number of different stories. Sauron crafts the ring way back in the Second Age, and as a part of that, he has this war with the elves in Middle-earth. He eventually gets captured by the Númenóreans and brought to Númenor, and that leads to the downfall of Númenor and the escape of the faithful from Númenor, and they found Gondor and Arnor. So you've got this vast sweep of history that all kind of comes down and filters to the point where we begin The Lord of the Rings, or The Hobbit if you want to go that far back, and all of it ends up getting contextualized within this broader historical framework. And that in itself is even more interesting than the whole music of the Ainur creating everything and everything being part of the same big story, because now we're talking about a little more granular events and how, the interplay of all these things work out. And you can see, not only do these things affect one another, but they have long lasting effects on, further history. Because if it had not been for Sauron's creation of the One Ring and his attempt to rule Middle-earth, you might not have had the Númenóreans intervene in the way that they did to capture Sauron, bring him to Númenor, and thereby bring about their own destruction, because Sauron corrupted them, which led to the king of Númenor deciding to attack, the Valar and Valinor, which led to the destruction of Númenor and the escape of the faithful to Middle-earth to found the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, which then become the most, powerful enemies that Sauron has in Middle-earth itself. And so he ends up, his action creates a reaction, which creates another, set of action, events after that, and it all works out in all kinds of different ways. And so you've got this really broad sense. And, Aragorn even refers to the broadest sense of this, going back to the whole creation aspect, because in his conversation with Eomer, at one point he's talking about halflings or hobbits, and one of the men with Eomer pipes up and says, "Aren't they just a matter of legend?" Or maybe he's even talking about himself as the heir of Elendil, and that's how it comes up. But at any rate, the guy with Eomer says, "Are we walking on the green grass in the daylight, or are we walking in legend?" And Aragorn says, "Green Earth is actually a mighty matter of legend." And of course, he's referring to the creation of the world there. So you've got references to these broader stories, and this all kind of sets up our feel for the fact that this is all contextualized in this bigger, broader narrative, which you don't really fully understand unless you read the Silmarillion, the appendices to the Lord of the Rings, and even more so you get, from like the Unfinished Tales and some of the other stuff that wasn't originally published by Tolkien. So that's kind of the broad stuff, but let's take a look at some of the really, really zoomed in granular stuff that really puts some of this into focus. One of the more interesting aspects of this, of course, is the connection between the Lord of the Rings as a story and the Silmarillion stories, because in The Hobbit, Tolkien is using names from the Silmarillion, but it's not really a part of Middle-earth at that stage, and it's not until he gets some distance into the Lord of the Rings that he decides, this is going to be part of my mythological world, and then he just goes all out with it, and it gets a lot more interesting in that way. So you've got this idea in the Lord of the Rings that it's all part of the Silmarillion, and the first really good hint of that is when the hobbits are with Aragorn, and at one point he decides at Weathertop that he's going to sing them the Lay of Leithian, or the Tale of Tinuviel and Beren. And he tells them a little bit about the story, and if you've never read the Silmarillion, you really have no idea what he's talking about. But if you have read the Silmarillion, or if you go back and read it after you've read the Lord of the Rings, this takes on a whole lot more meaning, because now you realize that there's this story way back in Middle-earth's past that involves, a mortal man and an elf maiden, which sets up a lot of Aragorn's own story as well. And they end up defeating Sauron as part of their story. They also end up stealing a Silmaril from Morgoth, but it's really interesting. Aragorn doesn't mention this particularly, but they, actually throw down Sauron himself in his own tower, basically, and end up going beyond that to steal a Silmaril from Morgoth. That's not really the central focus of the story, but it's really interesting how it kind of presages the events in The Lord of the Rings. And this becomes even more poignant later on in the story, because eventually, of course, we will get the marriage of Aragorn to Arwen, which is itself a recapitulation in some sense of the Beren and Luthien love story. But that's not even the most significant part. Aragorn and Arwen are themselves descendants of Beren and Luthien through different lines. Aragorn through the mortal line, and then Elrond and Arwen as part of the immortal line. And the way this happens, Elrond's father is Eärendil, and he also had another son, Elros. Elros becomes the first king of Númenor, from whom Aragorn is descended. Elrond remains in Middle-earth as an elf. Eärendil is actually the son of Tuor and Idril from Gondolin, but their mother, Eärendil's wife, is a descendant of Beren and Luthien and an escapee from the ruin of Doriath. And so you get these two lines intermingled, and eventually at the end of the first age, Elrond chooses to be an elf, and Elros chooses to be a mortal, and he ends up being the king of Númenor. And then these lines converge again at the end of the third age with Aragorn and Arwen, and that kind of is a renewal in some sense of what was kind of supposed to be the good things that came out of the end of the first age and the defeat of Morgoth and all these other things. But that's not even the really cool part, because eventually Before we get to Aragorn and Arwen, we actually get some other mentions of this same story. You may remember I noted that the father of Elros and Elrond was Eärendil. The Phial of Galadriel captures the light of the star Eärendil, which is literally Eärendil up in the sky in a magical boat with a Silmaril on his brow. The light captured in that phial is literally the same Silmaril that Beren and Luthien stole from Morgoth and passed down through their descendants, which came eventually to Eärendil, and he is now bearing that light, and then Galadriel captures that light in the Phial of Galadriel and gives it to Frodo. And eventually Sam will pick up on this point. Sam will actually say, why, we've still got, he's referring at one point to the story of Beren and Luthien when it's just him and Frodo and things are looking black, and he's talking about old stories, and he's talking about Beren and Luthien. He's like, wait a minute, we've got the same star from, the same light from that Silmaril in the phial that Lady Galadriel gave you. And he mentions, well, don't the great stories ever come to an end? And Frodo basically says, no, they never really do. They just carry on with different actors on the stage, basically. And it's a really fascinating look, because now we've got the Beren and Luthien story from the Silmarillion, which itself was a part of the greater narrative of the Silmarils, because the Silmarils are really kind of the central theme of the Silmarillion. Everything that happens in it pretty much is almost just a subset of things revolving around Morgoth stealing the Silmarils and the elves trying to get them back. And then men get caught up in it, and elves get caught up in it that weren't originally part of the story, and the whole thing. But this story, which involves the defeat of Sauron and the marriage of a mortal to an elf, ends up playing out, recapitulating, but also is just part of the same story, because the Lord of the Rings, basically is part of the same history, but Frodo and Sam recognize in this moment that they are literally just carrying on the story by carrying the light of the same Silmaril, which played so heavily in the history of Middle-earth ages before the moment that they're in. And that right there is just, it's harder to pick up on it when you don't know the Silmarillion story, but once you do, the full force of just how interwoven all of these things are becomes just incredible. And you realize Tolkien has managed to bring what to him was pretty much the central story of the Silmarillion in the first place, and make it almost the center of the Lord of the Rings as well, because not only do you have Frodo and Sam who are part of this story, and they're pretty much the heroes of the story, you also get Aragorn and Arwen, who Aragorn is more or less the secondary hero in the sense that he is the one who is renewing the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor. So you've got just this incredible interplay of events that he brings in by using material he had already written years before and just plops it into the Lord of the Rings and makes it all interconnected. And that's just one example of how really awesome Tolkien was at this. Speaking of Gondor and Arnor, of course, there's a huge amount of history that Tolkien has to create for Gondor and Arnor once he, kind of places all of this in the Middle-earth context. And he has to do this in part to explain, like, what are these kingdoms and why are they here, and why is Aragorn a descendant from the men of the West, and all this stuff. So, of course, he creates the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor as the kingdoms created by the faithful who escaped Numenor when it was destroyed as a result of Sauron corrupting them. And the faithful create these two kingdoms, and it's really interesting because Gondor spends basically all of its history either fighting off Mordor itself, or just Easterlings or Numenorians who were evil but were already in Middle-earth. And then Arnor in the north ends up being mostly the enemy of the kingdom of Angmar, which is headed up by the Witch King of Angmar, who is, of course, the Lord of the Nine, the chief of the ring race. And this is where things get really interesting, because the kingdom of Arnor, as it was, doesn't exist anymore. It's, Aragorn is the descendant of the kings of Arnor, but the kingdom fell long ago, roughly at the same time that Angmar fell, and so they haven't been operating as a kingdom. but there's still a lot of history there. And the first taste that we get of that history is when the hobbits meet Tom Bombadil, and Tom Bombadil starts telling them stories. And he starts off with just the old forest, and he tells them about Old Man Willow and his history and lots of other things. And then he starts moving a little broader, and Tolkien's description of the stories that Tom Bombadil tells here are very vague and generalized, but they're very, very powerful in the way that he gives these stories. But he tells them of, kings and, places that have, the burial sites of dead men that then became infested with evil. And then there's a line of kings, and they see one coming out with a star on his brow, and that's a presage of Aragorn right there, but that's not really the key point. The key point here is where he talks about the burial sites being infested with evil and then growing over, and then dark things came. And this comes into play very shortly after they leave Tom Bombadil, because they get caught in the Barrow Downs by Barrow Wights. And Barrow Wights are basically evil spirits that were sent to infest these burial mounds by the Witch King of Angmar. And this ends up being really important, because when they're caught, Bombadil ends up having to rescue them. And when Merry comes to, he's been out unconscious. Frodo's the only one who is awake for the whole thing. Merry ends up coming to, and it's like he's having memories of a battle that took place in Cardolan, which is one of the kingdoms that fell apart in the North Kingdom of Arnor. It split into three, and Cardolan was one of the three sub-kingdoms. And he says that the men of Carn Dûm came and we were worsted, and Carn Dûm is like the capital of Angmar. So he's having these memories, seemingly, of the men of Angmar attacking, the sub-kingdom of Arnor, and that's interesting in and of itself. It's like the process of whatever went on in there has somehow imbued him with the memories of actual historical events. Bombadil then, gives them swords, or rather daggers, out of the hoard of this barrow, and these are blades made by the Dunedain of Arnor to combat the Witch King of Angmar. And Merry will eventually use this when he stabs the Witch King in the back of the knee, giving Éowyn her opportunity to then kill him. Merry, therefore, has been caught up in this really long history of enmity between the Witch King and the Dunedain. And how does he finish off the story? He uses the Dunedain dagger to help Éowyn kill the Witch King in the battle that could have ended the Dunedain in Middle-earth, basically, by completely destroying Gondor, which there's still Dunedain in the north, of course, but relatively few. And if Gondor fell, that's basically it. And so Merry, who in some strange way became kind of a participant in the old history by having these memories, now kind of completes the cycle by destroying the Witch King, who was the main antagonist all those years ago. And so it's just really fascinating to see how his story becomes this small part of this much longer history involving wars between two sides that went on for years and years and years. And here he is, this one player, but he plays such a crucial role at the very end, using the same weapons as the one side was using way back then. And that's just really cool. Of course, there are also several other ways that we could say, these stories become parts of the story of the Lord of the Rings. Merry not only becomes part of the story of Arnor versus Angmar, he becomes part of the story of Rohan. And the Rohan story goes back years as well. The Rohirrim came from the north before they were the Rohirrim, and saved Gondor basically from destruction from invasions in the east, and were, as a result, granted by the then steward of Gondor the right to live in the land that now we know of as Rohan. And that, of course, is a presage of the fight at Minas Tirith as well, because the Rohirrim come again and save, or at least partially save, Gondor from destruction once again. And interestingly enough, it's in the time of the very last steward when this happens, because, well, I shouldn't say the last steward. The office of steward does not end with Denethor. Aragorn makes that clear, but the last ruling steward, I should say. And so you get a lot of that element as well. And again, you get like small hints of that sort of thing if you just read the main text, but if you read, you know, the appendices where Tolkien goes into the history that he creates for these different peoples, you get so much more detail and you understand the significance of all this. Similarly, of course, Pippin just becomes part of the larger history of Gondor, and his role in that history is relatively small, but he does preserve the stewardship by saving Faramir from death, even though Denethor, you know, practically almost killed Faramir and ended up killing himself. Pippin does preserve the stewardship in that way, and so he does play a role in that story as well. Other minor instances of the ways these stories get caught up with each other, of course, is the way that Legolas and Gimli have their friendship develop, which is extremely ironic when you realize exactly why these two peoples, elves and dwarves, don't tend to get along very well. You've got, you know, this history where dwarves ended up being part of the reason that Doriath ends up being destroyed, because they killed Thingol, who was the king, over the Silmaril, and then after that, Melian leaves, and the protection that Doriath had because of Melian is gone, and ever after you've got elves and dwarves hating each other. Legolas and Gimli are, of course, have their own slightly more petty grievances with each other, because Gimli is the son of Glóin, who was not exactly well treated by Legolas's father Thranduil in The Hobbit. And so there's, you know, some like a recapitulation almost of the same kind of enmity going on there, and Legolas and Gimli are part of that story, which is a smaller part of the bigger story that encompasses elves and dwarves. But then, because Gimli ends up becoming so enamored of Galadriel in Lothlorien, they end up becoming very fast friends, and they end up, you know, Legolas ends up going places with Gimli that he would not normally have gone. Likewise, Gimli ends up going places with Legolas that he would not otherwise have gone, and they both end up being instrumental in helping to rebuild and re-beautify Minas Tirith after the war is over. And so you get this, it's kind of a nice closing chapter. You get the idea that in these events, maybe not the entire races of elves and dwarves have really kind of become friends, but at least there is a sense in which there is hope for that because of their stories. So those are some of the more minor ways that we can see these stories being played out, in addition to those really bigger ones earlier. And of course, the history of the ring itself is just long, well, you know, laid out by Tolkien between, you know, the return of, not the return of the I forget the name of the chapter now, it's escaping me, but the chapter where Gandalf explains lots of stuff, and then in the chapter of, you know, the Council of Elrond, they go through a lot of stuff. You've got the second, you know, the last alliance with, you know, at the end of the Second Age, all of these big stories, which Sam even references the last alliance whenever he throws out a poem about Gil-galad at one point when they're traveling with Strider. So, I mean, you've got all these references to these stories, and there's just tons of them, and you can't really cover them all. And I've done my best to cover what I think are some of the more significant ones in terms of seeing just how well Tolkien does this. But I'd be curious to know if you think that there's another version of this that I should have included that I didn't. So if you can think of any that I didn't mention that I should have, please list them in the comments below. If you liked the video, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around. And if you want to follow me over on Twitter, I'm at JRRTLore, and I occasionally drop some Tolkien-related trivia questions. If you want to subscribe to the channel, you can do that here. Don't forget to click the bell icon. You can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.